For our court case, we will be discussing CBS versus the Democratic National Committee. In order to better understand this case, we need to take a look at the historical background. This case took place during the early 1970s, which was an era of political unrest, anti-Vietnam War protests, and growing public distrust in the government. This era also marks the rise of television as a dominant platform for public debate and political messaging. The Democratic National Committee, also known as the DNC, and similar groups attempted to purchase airtime for political advertisements. CBS and other broadcasters refused, citing their right to control editorial content. The DNC claimed this violated the First Amendment, arguing for equal access to the airwaves. To better understand the historical context of this case, this is a video from 1972 of an anti-Vietnam PSA produced by Clergy and Laymen Concerned, a religious activist group speaking out against U.S. involvement in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Despite its urgency and moral weight, this message was barred from mainstream television and only aired on alternative outlets like Underground News. Its exclusion reflects the central issue in CBS versus DNC of who controls public airways. This PSA serves as an example of the type of political speech networks were able to suppress, raising ongoing questions about how media access shapes public discourse.
The mother bombs release the baby bombs. The baby bombs explode and scatter the pellets over an area the size of 10 football fields, with enough force to puncture the head or chest or stomach of a North Vietnamese soldier or a water buffalo or a baby. We're dropping thousands and thousands of these mother bombs on the people of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Let's hear it from motherhood and the flag.
The Fairness Doctrine played a large role in this court case. This is an FCC policy requiring broadcasters to present fair and balanced coverage of controversial issues. It was rooted in the principle that broadcast frequencies are public resources. The DNC stance was because broadcasters use public airwaves, they had a responsibility to provide access to diverse viewpoints, including paid political ads. CBS argued for editorial freedom, stating that the First Amendment protected their right to refuse paid political content. So the question this court case aims to answer is whether requiring broadcast media to accept paid editorial advertisements from political organizations violates the First Amendment.
The answer to that question is no. The court agreed that broadcasters are not required by the First Amendment or the Fairness Doctrine to accept paid editorial advertisements from political organizations. So the court agreed while broadcasters operate under government licenses and must serve the public interest, and thus be under the Fairness Doctrine, they retain a significant amount of editorial control or journalistic discretion, and they're not obligated by the First Amendment to sell airtime to these political issue advertisements. This ruling pretty much says that these broadcasters are private actors or private organizations, and while they do have to follow government regulations, there are limits to that. So there is only so far that the government can control them. And so while they must treat everyone under Fairness Doctrine in a fair and acceptable manner, and they must report in a fair and acceptable manner, they do not have to take these paid editorial advertisements, and it's not violating anyone's First Amendment right on either side. A quote from this would be from a law journal that said, "Broadcasters, as licenses of a scarce public resource, possess significant journalistic discretion on deciding what to air." So they're allowed to decide what content they put out, what content they don't want to put out. And the freedom of speech actually is not prohibiting this, it is involving this, allowing them to pick and choose what they would like to say and what they don't, as long as it's not egregious or, defamatory or something that is false.
Okay, now we're going to talk about how and why the court reached this decision. The court held that broadcast media are private forums, not public ones. Even though the airwaves are public property, The stations using them are privately owned and have the right to exercise editorial control over what they air. Broadcasters do operate under FCC licenses and must serve the public interest, but that doesn't mean they're required to sell airtime to political groups. In this case, CBS's refusal to air anti-war ads from the DNC wasn't a First Amendment violation. It was a legal use of editorial judgment. The ruling emphasized that compelled access equals compelled speech, which the First Amendment prohibits. Just as individuals can't be forced to speak, media outlets can't be forced to amplify speech they don't endorse. Finally, the court clarified that the First Amendment protects a diversity of viewpoints, but it doesn't guarantee a right to use someone else's platform. This decision helped preserve the independence of the press and reinforce the balance between public service and private editorial freedom. One of the key takeaways from CBS versus the Democratic National Committee is that editorial judgment is a legal right, not something broadcasters are required to give up. Just like newspapers aren't forced to publish every letter to the editor, broadcast stations don't have to accept every political ad or editorial. The court said that forcing access like this would undermine a station's editorial autonomy, which is essential to its role as an independent communicator. Now, while broadcasters do have to follow the FCC's public interest standard, this doesn't mean they're required to sell airtime for political messages. They're expected to cover public affairs fairly and accurately, but they can choose how and when to do that. The FCC encourages diverse programming, but it doesn't dictate content. That's left to the broadcasters. This ruling is really about protecting the independence of the press. By saying broadcasters can't be forced to air content they don't support, the court reinforced the idea that freedom of the press means freedom from being compelled to speak. The First Amendment protects not only the right to speak, but also the right not to speak. In short, CBS versus DNC helped preserve a balance. Broadcasters must serve the public, yes, but they do so as independent voices, not as mandatory platforms for paid political speech. This protects a media environment where ideas rise on merit, not on money.
So this case was argued on October 16, 1972, and its decision was reached on May 29, 1973. So it's about 225 days in between the day it was put out and the day that they reached a decision. And other than just CBS and the DNC, there were other advocates inside of this, including Post Newsweek, BEMVP, and ABC. So in its decision, the court ruled 7-2 in favor of the petitioner, CBS, and below you can see the list of all the Supreme Court justices, and the gray ones are the ones that didn't vote in favor. So the Supreme Court ruled that private broadcasters are not obligated to air paid political advertisements. As mentioned before, compelled access equals compelled speech, and they decided that they were not in concurrence with the First Amendment violation. So it was allowed for the broadcasters to pick and choose what advertisements they wanted and what advertisements they weren't going to put out. This really affects modern discussions of media platform control, especially in this day and age when there were lots of bans on what platforms could have, what bans were talking about on the internet, and if they could ban certain things, or if it was actually a public forum rather than a limited public forum that someone could control. And those discussions are going on all the time, and a lot of times this case is brought up as pretty much a precedent for past cases.
And here are some of our sources. We hope you enjoyed our presentation and learned something new. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have about this case. Thank you.